She didn't clap when my name was called, but what I handed her that night made her finally see me. Hi, I'm Natalie, and I'm 34 years old now, but some memories still sit in my chest like they happened yesterday. My graduation wasn't supposed to be complicated. I had worked so hard for that moment, years of late nights and sacrifices that nobody in my family ever really noticed. I thought walking across that stage would finally make them proud. I thought wrong. My mother sat in the third row, and her eyes were somewhere else entirely. Growing up, I was the quiet daughter, the one who never caused trouble, but also never seemed to spark much interest. My younger sister Jenna was different. She was louder, funnier, more magnetic. My mother gravitated toward her like sunlight finds a window. I never resented Jenna for it because she didn't ask for the attention. But I did wonder, sometimes late at night, what I lacked. What made me so easy to overlook? I carried that question into adulthood without ever finding an answer. My mother and I weren't enemies. We just existed in parallel lines that never quite touched. She remembered Jenna's soccer games and choir concerts. She forgot my science fairs and debate tournaments. When I got accepted into nursing school, she nodded and changed the subject to Jenna's new apartment. It wasn't cruelty. It was something quieter, almost worse. Indifference dressed up as normalcy. I learned to celebrate myself in silence and expect nothing more from her. Graduation day arrived on a warm Saturday in May. The sky was impossibly blue, the kind of day that feels like a promise. I wore my cap and gown and felt something close to hope stirring in my chest. Maybe today would be different. Maybe watching me receive my degree would unlock something in my mother, some pride she had been saving. I drove to the ceremony with my stomach full of butterflies and my heart full of cautious optimism. The auditorium was packed with families holding balloons and homemade signs. I spotted my mother in the crowd, seated between two strangers. She was scrolling through her phone, her face blank. Jenna hadn't come because she was busy with her own life, which I understood. But my mother was there, physically present, yet somehow absent. I waved at her from the processional line. She didn't wave back. She didn't even look up. That small moment cracked something inside me. When they called my name, I walked across the stage with my head held high. I shook the dean's hand and accepted my diploma, and for a few seconds, I let myself feel proud. I had done this. Years of balancing work and school, of missing holidays and skipping vacations. I had earned this moment with my own two hands. I glanced toward my mother's seat, hoping to catch her eyes. She was typing a text message. My smile faltered, but I kept walking. After the ceremony, families gathered outside for photographs and tearful embraces. I stood alone for a moment, clutching my diploma folder, watching other graduates hug their mothers. A strange calm settled over me. I had prepared for this possibility. Disappointment was familiar territory, and I knew how to navigate it. But this time, I had something else. Something I had been carrying in my purse for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. An envelope that held more than paper. I found my mother near the parking lot, checking her watch like she had somewhere better to be. She congratulated me with a brief hug that lasted maybe 2 seconds. Her voice was polite but hollow, the kind of tone you use with acquaintances. I thanked her for coming, and she shrugged like it was nothing. Because to her, maybe it was nothing. Just another obligation checked off a list. I took a breath and reached into my purse. The envelope was plain white, slightly wrinkled from being carried around for weeks. Inside was a letter and a check. Not just any check. The culmination of 5 years of secret savings and careful planning. I had bought something that would change both our lives, but she didn't know that yet. I held the envelope in my hands and felt its weight. Not physical, but emotional. This was my way of finally being seen, even if I had to force the moment myself. I handed her the envelope without explanation. She looked confused, maybe even annoyed, like I was making her late for something. She opened it carelessly, pulling out the letter first. I watched her eyes scan the words, watched her expression shift from impatience to confusion to something I couldn't quite name. She read it twice, her lips moving slightly. Then she looked at the check attached to the bottom of the page. Her hand began to tremble. The letter explained everything. 5 years ago, I had started a separate savings account. Every extra dollar from my nursing shifts, every tax refund, every birthday gift I received in cash. I saved it all with one goal in mind. My mother's house, the one she grew up in, had been facing foreclosure for 2 years. She never told me directly, but I overheard enough phone calls to piece the story together. I paid off the remaining balance in full. She looked up at me with tears forming in her eyes. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother was looking at me like I was real, like I mattered, like I had done something worthy of her attention. It wasn't the reaction I had imagined, but it was honest. Raw. I didn't need her to say anything. Her face said everything her words never could. She asked me why. Why would I do this after everything, after years of feeling invisible in my own family? I told her the truth. I didn't do it for gratitude or recognition. I did it because that house held memories of my grandmother, of summer vacations and holiday dinners and the smell of pie baking in the kitchen. I couldn't let those memories disappear. I did it because love doesn't always need to be returned equally. We stood in that parking lot for a long time, neither of us sure what to say next. Other families walked past us, laughing and celebrating, unaware of the quiet earthquake happening between a mother and daughter. She finally pulled me into a hug, a real one this time. I felt her arms tighten around me, felt her tears dampen my graduation gown. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. On the drive home, I thought about all the years I spent waiting for my mother to notice me, waiting for her to show up at my events, to ask about my dreams, to treat me like I was worth her time. I had wasted so much energy on that waiting. The envelope wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving something to myself, that I could be generous even when generosity wasn't given to me first. My mother called me the next morning, something she rarely did. Her voice was softer than usual, almost tentative. She asked about my plans for the future, about my job, about things she had never shown interest in before. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. People don't change overnight, and I knew better than to expect miracles. But she was trying. For the first time, she was genuinely trying. That meant more than any applause ever could. Jenna found out about the house a week later. She called me, surprised and maybe a little embarrassed that she hadn't known about the foreclosure situation. We talked for an hour, longer than we had talked in years. She admitted that she always assumed I was fine, that I didn't need anyone because I never asked for help. I realized that my silence had built walls I never intended to construct. Sometimes being strong looks a lot like being distant. Months passed, and my relationship with my mother slowly began to heal. We weren't suddenly best friends, and old habits still crept in. She still favored Jenna in small, unconscious ways. But now she also called me on Sundays, asked about my patients, remembered my birthday without a reminder. Progress isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's just a phone call that didn't used to happen. Sometimes it's a question that shows someone is finally paying attention. I learned something important that graduation day. You can't force someone to love you the way you need to be loved, but you can choose how you respond to that gap. I chose generosity over bitterness, action over resentment. That envelope wasn't a transaction. It was a release. I let go of the daughter who waited in corners, hoping to be seen. I became the woman who steps into the light on her own terms. Today, the framed photo from my graduation sits on my mother's mantle, right next to Jenna's wedding picture. She put it there herself, without me asking. It's a small thing, maybe meaningless to anyone else. But to me, it's everything. It tells me that I finally exist in her world, not as a shadow, but as a daughter worth remembering. And that's the only inheritance I ever really wanted. I thought saving her house would be enough. But the truth she finally told me at Thanksgiving broke me open in ways I never expected. 6 months had passed since graduation day, and I was learning that healing isn't a straight line. My mother and I were talking more, yes, but our conversations still felt like walking on a frozen lake. Every step was careful, measured, aware that the ice could crack at any moment. I wanted to trust this new version of us, but part of me kept waiting for her to drift back into old patterns. Hope and caution lived side by side in my chest. Thanksgiving was approaching, and for the first time in years, my mother invited me to help prepare the meal. Usually, that honor belonged exclusively to Jenna. I remember standing in my apartment, reading her text message 3 times just to make sure I understood correctly. She wanted me there early, wanted my help with the turkey and the pies. Such a simple invitation, yet it made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. I typed back yes before I could overthink it. I arrived at her house the morning of Thanksgiving, carrying grocery bags and a nervous heart. The house looked different somehow, brighter and more welcoming than I remembered. She had put autumn decorations on the porch, something she used to say was a waste of time. When she opened the door, she smiled at me, a real smile that reached her eyes. I stepped inside and smelled cinnamon and brown sugar. It smelled like the childhood I always wished I had. We worked side by side in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and seasoning the turkey. She asked me about my patients, about the hospital, about a coworker I had mentioned once in passing. I was stunned that she remembered. We talked about small things, safe things, but underneath the surface I felt something shifting. She was making an effort, and I was letting myself receive it. The kitchen filled with warmth, and for a moment, everything felt possible. Jenna arrived around noon with a bottle of wine and her usual bright energy. She hugged our mother first, then me, and I noticed something different in her expression. She seemed quieter, more observant, like she was studying the scene in front of her. I wondered if she felt displaced by my new presence in the kitchen, but when she caught my eye, she smiled genuinely. Maybe she was just happy to see us together. Maybe change was possible for all 3 of us. Dinner was beautiful, the table full of food, and the conversation full of laughter. We shared memories from childhood, funny stories about holidays gone wrong, and embarrassing moments we had never discussed. My mother laughed until she cried, and I realized I had never seen her this relaxed. It felt like a family I had only seen in movies, one I had stopped believing could be mine. I let myself sink into the moment without questioning it. After dessert, Jenna excused herself to call her boyfriend, leaving my mother and me alone at the table. The house grew quiet, and the mood shifted into something more serious. She poured herself another glass of wine and stared at it for a long moment. I could tell she wanted to say something important, something that had been building for a while. I waited, giving her space, feeling my heartbeat quicken in the silence between us. She started talking about my father, a subject we almost never touched. He left when I was 4 and Jenna was 2, disappeared one night without explanation. My mother raised us alone, working double shifts and stretching every dollar. I always admired her strength, even when I resented her distance. But now she was telling me something I had never heard before. She said looking at me was sometimes painful because I reminded her so much of him. I didn't know how to respond. My face, my mannerisms, even the way I tilted my head when thinking. Apparently, all of it mirrored a man who had broken her heart. She said she didn't realize she was pulling away from me. It wasn't conscious, wasn't intentional. But every time she looked at me, she saw the ghost of someone who left. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and impossible to ignore. I finally understood something I had wondered about my whole life. She apologized, truly apologized, with tears running down her cheeks. She said she had failed me in ways she was only beginning to understand. The favoritism toward Jenna wasn't about loving her more. It was about loving me while carrying pain she didn't know how to process. I listened without interrupting, letting her finish, letting her finally say the things she had buried for 30 years. My own tears fell silently, landing on the tablecloth like small confessions. I told her I forgave her, and I meant it. Not because the pain disappeared instantly, but because holding on to resentment had exhausted me. I had spent so many years building walls to protect myself from her indifference. Now those walls felt unnecessary, even cruel. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. We sat like that for a long time, two women finally seeing each other clearly, finally allowing themselves to be seen. Jenna returned to find us holding hands and crying. She stopped in the doorway, confused, maybe worried that something terrible had happened. My mother explained, briefly and honestly, what she had just confessed to me. Jenna's face went through a dozen emotions in seconds. She sat down slowly, processing the revelation that the family dynamic she had always known was built on hidden grief. She looked at me with new eyes full of understanding and something like guilt. Jenna apologized too, though she had less to apologize for. She said she never realized how differently our mother treated us, because from her perspective, everything seemed normal. She assumed I was independent by choice, distant by preference. Learning the truth made her reevaluate every childhood memory. I told her she didn't need to carry guilt for something she didn't cause. We were both just children navigating a situation created by adults and their unspoken wounds. That night, I drove home through quiet streets lit by early Christmas decorations. The radio played soft music, but I barely heard it. My mind was full of everything my mother had said, every truth that had finally surfaced after decades of silence. I felt lighter somehow, like a weight I didn't know I was carrying had been gently removed. The ache was still there, but it was different now. It was an ache that was finally being acknowledged and tended to. The weeks that followed brought more conversations, more honesty, more slow and careful rebuilding. My mother started asking about my father, wondering if I wanted to know more about him. I wasn't sure how to answer. Part of me was curious, hungry for information about the man whose face I apparently wore. But another part was afraid. What if knowing more only created new wounds? I told her I needed time to think, and she respected that without pushing. Christmas arrived with unexpected warmth. My mother gave me a gift that made me cry. A photo album she had assembled, full of pictures from my childhood that I had never seen. School plays and birthday parties and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. She had been capturing moments all along, even when I thought she wasn't paying attention. The album proved that her love existed, even when it was hidden beneath layers of complicated grief. I held it against my chest like something precious. Jenna and I grew closer that winter, talking on the phone more often, sharing things we had never shared before. She admitted that being the favored child came with its own pressure, the constant need to perform and please. I had never considered that her position might have been exhausting too. We were both shaped by the same fractured family, just in different ways. Understanding that created a bridge between us that felt stronger than any we had before. By spring, I had made a decision about my father. I told my mother I wanted to know more, wanted to understand who he was before he became the man who left. She nodded slowly, then disappeared into her bedroom. She returned with a shoebox full of letters, photographs, and small mementos from their brief marriage. She handed it to me like she was handing me a piece of her heart. I took it home and opened it alone, ready to meet the ghost. The letters revealed a complicated man, someone who loved deeply but struggled with commitment and fear. He wrote about wanting to be a good father, about feeling overwhelmed by responsibility. His words were honest and sad, full of self-awareness, but lacking courage. I didn't forgive him for leaving, but I understood him a little better. And understanding brought a strange kind of peace, like finishing a book that had been left open for too long. Today, my relationship with my mother continues to grow in small, meaningful ways. We have Sunday dinners and phone calls that last longer than 5 minutes. She tells me she's proud of me now, unprompted, like she's making up for lost time. I don't need her to say it anymore, but I appreciate that she does. Some wounds leave scars that never fully fade, but scars can also be proof of healing. I carry mine with grace, knowing they shaped me into someone capable of extraordinary love. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and the handwriting belonged to a man I had spent my whole life trying to forget. Spring had settled into our small town with blooming dogwoods and longer evenings. I was finally feeling like my life had found a rhythm that made sense. Work was fulfilling, My relationship with my mother was stronger than ever, and Jenna had become someone I actually called a friend. The shoebox of letters still sat on my dresser, but I had stopped opening it every night. I thought I had made peace with the past. Then the mailman changed everything. The envelope was plain, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize at first. There was no return address, just a postmark from a town in Ohio I had never heard of. I almost threw it away, assuming it was junk mail or a misdirected letter. But something made me pause. Something about the way my name was written, careful and deliberate, like the person had practiced it several times. I opened it standing in my kitchen, completely unprepared. The letter was from my father. David Allen Mitchell, the man who vanished when I was 4 years old, had somehow found my address and decided to write. My hands trembled as I read his words, neat cursive filling 2 pages. He said he had been following my life from a distance, that he knew about my nursing degree and my graduation. He said he wanted to explain, to apologize, to ask if there was any possibility of meeting. I sat down hard on a kitchen chair. For 3 days, I told no one about the letter. I carried it in my purse like a secret bomb, aware of its weight every moment. At work, I smiled at patients and filled out charts while my mind raced with questions. How did he find me? Why now, after 30 years of silence? Did I even want to hear his explanations? The father I had imagined in childhood was a villain, a coward. But the letters in the shoebox had shown me someone more complicated than that. I finally called Jenna on the 4th day, needing to share the burden with someone who would understand. She listened without interrupting, her breath quiet on the other end of the line. When I finished reading her the letter, she was silent for a long moment. Then she asked me how I felt, really felt, underneath all the confusion. I told her I didn't know. I told her I was terrified of wanting something that might only hurt me again. Jenna offered to come over that weekend, and I accepted gratefully. She arrived Saturday morning with coffee and pastries, settling into my couch like she belonged there. We talked for hours about our father, about the fragments of memory we each carried. She remembered even less than I did, just vague impressions of a tall man with a deep voice. For her, he was almost entirely a story. For me, he was a wound that had never fully closed. We debated whether to tell our mother. Part of me felt like she deserved to know, especially after all the honesty we had shared at Thanksgiving. But another part worried about reopening old pain for her. She had spent 30 years building a life without him, raising 2 daughters alone, surviving through sheer determination. Would telling her about the letter undo all the healing we had accomplished? Jenna thought she could handle it. I wasn't so sure. I decided to wait before telling my mother, but I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. At night, I would read it again, searching for hidden meanings in every sentence. My father wrote about regret, about years spent wondering if he had made the right choice. He admitted that leaving was the greatest mistake of his life, but he had convinced himself we were better off without him. His logic was flawed, his reasoning selfish, but there was genuine sorrow in his words, and that complicated everything. 2 weeks after receiving the letter, I wrote back. I didn't commit to meeting him, didn't offer forgiveness or understanding. I simply acknowledged that I had received his message and needed time to process. I asked questions that had haunted me for decades: why he left, where he went, whether he ever tried to come back. I mailed the letter before I could change my mind, then spent the next week checking my mailbox with anxious hope. His response arrived faster than I expected. He answered every question honestly, holding nothing back. He explained that he had struggled with depression and anxiety, that fatherhood had overwhelmed him in ways he couldn't articulate at the time. He left because he believed his darkness would contaminate us, that we deserved a chance at happiness he couldn't provide. He was wrong, he admitted. Running away only created different kinds of damage. His honesty was painful, but it was also strangely healing. I finally told my mother on a quiet Sunday afternoon. We were sitting on her porch, watching birds gather at the feeder she had recently installed. I handed her the letters, both his original one and his response to my questions. She read them slowly, her face impossible to interpret. When she finished, she folded them carefully and handed them back. She asked me what I wanted to do, her voice neutral and steady. She was letting me lead. I told her I was considering meeting him, just once, to see his face and hear his voice. I needed closure, needed to transform the ghost into a real person I could finally understand. She nodded slowly, absorbing my words. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she had always wondered if this day would come, if he would eventually reach out. Part of her had been waiting for it too, even hoping for it. She wanted me to have what she never could. Jenna joined us on the porch, sensing that something important was happening. My mother explained the situation, and Jenna squeezed my hand in silent support. The three of us sat together as the sun began to set, discussing possibilities and fears and hopes. It felt surreal, this unity we had built from years of distance and misunderstanding. Whatever happened with my father, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. My family, imperfect as it was, would stand beside me. I agreed to meet my father in a public place, a coffee shop in a town halfway between us. We set the date for a Saturday in early June, giving me several weeks to prepare emotionally. I didn't know what to expect, didn't know if I would feel anger or sadness or nothing at all. I bought a new dress for the occasion, something that made me feel confident. I wanted him to see the woman I had become despite his absence. The morning of the meeting, I woke before dawn, my stomach tight with nervous energy. I drove the 2 hours to the coffee shop with the radio off, rehearsing what I might say. When I arrived, I sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching the entrance. Then I saw him, an older man with gray hair and my exact eyes, standing near the door, looking just as nervous as I felt. He was real. After 30 years of being a photograph and a story, he was finally real. We sat across from each other at a small table near the window. He looked at me like I was something precious, something he couldn't believe existed. I looked at him searching for myself, finding pieces of my face in his features. We talked for 3 hours, covering decades of missed birthdays and graduations and ordinary days. He cried twice. I cried once. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It was the bridge neither of us knew how to build until now. He didn't ask for forgiveness, which I appreciated. He said he knew he didn't deserve it, knew that some choices create consequences that can never be fully undone. What he wanted, he explained, was simply a chance to know me, to be some small part of my life going forward. He wasn't trying to replace the years he had missed. He just wanted to stop missing the years still to come. His humility touched something deep inside me. I drove home that evening feeling like a different person. Not transformed exactly, but expanded. I had faced the ghost that haunted my childhood and discovered he was just a man, flawed and frightened and full of regret. I called my mother from the road, telling her about the meeting, sharing the details she wanted to hear. She listened quietly, then told me she was proud of me. Those words meant more than ever, coming after such a difficult journey. The following months brought more meetings, more conversations, more slow and careful relationship building with my father. He wasn't trying to be a dad in any traditional sense. We were two adults getting to know each other, navigating the strange territory between strangers and family. Some days felt natural and easy. Other days felt awkward and forced. But we kept showing up for each other, kept choosing connection over the easier path of distance. Today, my family looks different than it did a year ago. I have a mother who sees me, a sister who knows me, and a father who is learning me. The house my mother almost lost is filled with new memories now, with holiday dinners that include laughter and honesty. I still carry old wounds, probably always will. But I also carry something new, the knowledge that it's never too late to rewrite your story, to choose love over fear, to open doors you thought were permanently closed. My father asked to see my mother one last time, and the reason behind his request shattered everything I thought I knew about their story. Summer faded into autumn, and the leaves outside my apartment window turned brilliant shades of orange and gold. My life had settled into a new rhythm that still surprised me sometimes. Sunday dinners with my mother, occasional coffee dates with my father, weekly phone calls with Jenna. The broken pieces of my family hadn't formed a perfect picture, but they had become something recognizable, something that felt like home. I was learning to hold complexity without needing to resolve it completely. My father and I had developed our own traditions over the past few months. We met every other Saturday at the same coffee shop where we first reconnected. He would order black coffee, I would order chamomile tea, and we would talk about everything and nothing. He told me stories about his childhood, his first job, his years of wandering after he left us. I told him about nursing school, about my patients, about the small victories that made my work meaningful. One Saturday in late October, he seemed different. Quieter, more distracted, his eyes carrying a weight I hadn't seen before. I asked if something was wrong, and he stirred his coffee for a long moment before answering. He said he had been to the doctor recently, just a routine checkup that turned into something more concerning. They found something in his lungs, something that needed more tests. He said it casually, like he was discussing the weather, but his hands were trembling. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. We had just found each other, just begun building something real from the ruins of 30 years. The idea of losing him now felt impossibly cruel. I reached across the table and took his hand, not caring who might be watching. He squeezed back, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The coffee shop buzzed around us. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the small earthquake happening at our corner table. He told me the doctors were optimistic, that they had caught it early and treatment options were good. But facing his mortality had stirred something in him, a need to settle accounts he had left open for too long. He looked at me with those eyes that mirrored my own, and asked if I thought my mother would ever agree to see him, not to reconcile, not to rekindle anything romantic, just to talk, to apologize properly, to close a chapter that had been left painfully unfinished. The request caught me off guard. My mother and I had come so far in our healing, and I worried that introducing my father back into her life might undo that progress. But I also understood his need for closure, especially now, especially facing an uncertain future. I told him I would ask her, but I couldn't make any promises. She had every right to say no, every right to protect herself from old pain. He nodded, accepting this, grateful that I would even try. I waited 3 days before bringing it up with my mother. We were washing dishes together after Sunday dinner, our hands moving in familiar rhythm. I told her about his diagnosis first, watching her face carefully for reaction. She paused, a plate suspended in soapy water, and something flickered across her expression. Not quite sadness, not quite relief, something in between. She asked if he was going to be okay, and I heard genuine concern beneath her cautious tone. Then I told her about his request. She set down the plate and dried her hands slowly, deliberately, buying time to gather her thoughts. The kitchen felt very quiet, the only sound the dripping faucet she kept meaning to fix. She asked me what I thought she should do, and I told her honestly that I didn't know. This wasn't my decision to make. She had earned the right to choose her own boundaries, to protect her own peace. Whatever she decided, I would support her completely. She didn't answer that night. Days passed, then a week, and she didn't mention it again. I didn't push, letting her process at her own pace. Meanwhile, my father's tests came back with mixed results. The growth was small but concerning, requiring surgery followed by treatment. He took the news with quiet acceptance, focusing on practical matters like scheduling and recovery plans. I admired his calmness, while also recognizing it as a kind of shield against fear. 2 weeks before his surgery, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening. Her voice was steady but soft, the way it got when she was about to say something important. She told me she had thought about it carefully, prayed about it, discussed it with her pastor. She had decided to meet with my father. Not for his sake, she clarified, but for her own. She had been carrying unfinished business too, words she never got to say. It was time to finally say them. We arranged the meeting at my mother's house, on neutral territory where she would feel most comfortable. I offered to be present, but she declined. This conversation needed to happen between just the two of them, without an audience, without a mediator. I respected her wishes while privately worrying about how it would go. These two people had once loved each other enough to create children together. Now, they were strangers with decades of hurt between them. The day of the meeting, I stayed home and tried to distract myself with housework and television. Neither worked. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a message or call that would tell me how it was going. Hours passed with no word. I made dinner, couldn't eat it, wrapped it up for later. Finally, around 8 in the evening, my mother called. Her voice was thick, like she had been crying, but there was something else underneath, something that sounded almost like peace. She told me they had talked for 5 hours, covering everything from their early romance to his departure to the years of silence that followed. He apologized for leaving, for the cowardice that drove him away, for every birthday and graduation he missed. She apologized, too, for things I didn't fully understand. Old grievances from their marriage that predated my memory. They had both been young and scared and unprepared for the weight of building a life together. Neither was entirely innocent. What surprised her most, she said, was that she didn't feel angry anymore. The rage she had carried for 30 years had somehow transformed into something softer during those 5 hours. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding, acceptance, a recognition that holding on to bitterness only poisoned her own heart. She said she felt lighter than she had in decades, like setting down a suitcase she didn't realize she was still carrying. I cried listening to her, grateful beyond words. My father's surgery happened the following week. I took time off work to be there, sitting in the waiting room with terrible coffee and outdated magazines. Jenna came too, meeting our father for only the second time. She held my hand during the longest hours, telling me stories about her job and her boyfriend to keep my mind occupied. When the surgeon finally emerged with good news, we held each other and cried. The growth was removed successfully. His prognosis was excellent. During his recovery, something unexpected happened. My mother started visiting him. Not romantic visits, nothing like that, but friendly ones. She would bring soup or books or just sit with him while he healed. Jenna and I watched this development with amazement, unsure what to make of it. Two people who had once destroyed each other were now offering small kindnesses. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something stranger and more beautiful. It was two humans choosing compassion over old wounds. By Christmas, we made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. We would spend the holiday together. My mother, my father, Jenna, and me. Not as a reunited family pretending the past didn't happen, but as 4 people who had each traveled their own difficult journey to arrive at this moment. My mother insisted on hosting, wanting the gathering to happen in the house I had saved, the house full of my grandmother's memories. Christmas morning was surreal and wonderful and strange. My father sat in the living room where he had once lived as a young husband, surrounded by decorations he didn't help choose, accepting coffee from a woman he had abandoned decades ago. But there was no tension, no awkwardness, just a quiet recognition that life had brought us all somewhere unexpected. We opened presents and ate too much food and laughed at old stories that now seemed funny instead of painful. That night, after my father had gone home and Jenna had fallen asleep on the couch, my mother and I sat by the Christmas tree in comfortable silence. She told me she was grateful, not just for saving the house, but for being the person who held our family together when everyone else had given up. She said I had inherited the best parts of both my parents, my father's thoughtfulness and her own stubborn strength. I had never heard her compare me to him without pain before. Looking back now, I understand that families are never finished healing. There is no final destination, no moment where everything is permanently fixed. There are only choices, made day after day, to keep showing up for each other. My father still lives in Ohio, but we talk weekly and visit when we can. My mother has found a peace she never expected. And I have discovered that the family I always wanted was never something I needed to wait for. It was something I had the power to build all along. 1 year after everything changed, I stood in my grandmother's garden holding a secret of my own. and this time, I was ready to share it. A full year had passed since that first graduation day when I handed my mother an envelope and changed the course of our family. 12 months of healing, reconnecting, and learning that love doesn't follow the timelines we imagine. I was 35 now, standing in the backyard of my mother's house, watching her plant tulip bulbs in the garden my grandmother had started decades ago. The autumn air smelled like earth and possibility. I had news that would change everything again. I had met someone. His name was Michael, a physical therapist at the hospital where I worked. We had been colleagues for 2 years before he finally asked me to coffee, nervous and stumbling over his words in a way that made me smile. Our relationship had grown slowly, carefully, both of us cautious people who had learned that rushing led to heartbreak. 6 months into dating, I knew he was different. He listened when I talked about my complicated family. He never judged. Michael had met my mother twice now, both times at Sunday dinner. She adored him immediately, commenting on his kind eyes and the way he looked at me like I was something precious. Jenna approved too, texting me after their first meeting to say he was a keeper. Even my father had spoken with him on the phone, a brief but warm conversation that meant more to me than I could express. My family, fractured and rebuilt, had welcomed him without hesitation, but I hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy test I took 3 weeks ago. The positive result sat in my bathroom drawer like a secret treasure, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, emotions swirling together until I couldn't separate them. A baby. After everything I had experienced with my own family, I was going to become a mother. The weight of that responsibility took my breath away sometimes. Michael knew, of course. He was with me when I took the test, holding my hand while we waited those impossible 3 minutes. When the line appeared, he cried before I did. He talked about nursery colors and baby names and all the ways our lives were about to expand. His joy was infectious, pulling me out of my fear and into excitement. But I needed to tell my mother first, needed to see her face when she learned she would become a grandmother. I'd planned to tell her today, during our Saturday gardening session, but watching her work the soil with such contentment, I found myself hesitating. So much had changed between us already. Adding a grandchild to the equation felt enormous, like asking a healing bone to bear weight before it was ready. Yet I also knew she would want to know, would be hurt if I waited too long. I took a deep breath and walked toward her, my heart pounding against my ribs. She looked up as I approached, wiping dirt from her hands onto her old jeans. Her face had softened over the past year, the tension lines around her eyes less pronounced. She smiled at me, and I saw genuine warmth there, the kind I had spent my childhood longing for. I sat down on the garden bench beside her and told her I had something important to share. Her expression shifted to curiosity, maybe a hint of concern. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the ultrasound photo. For a moment, she just stared at the small black and white image, her brain processing what her eyes were seeing. Then understanding dawned, spreading across her face like sunrise. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She looked at me with such overwhelming joy that I started crying too. She pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe, and I felt 35 years of distance collapse into nothing. This was the mother I had always needed. She asked 100 questions all at once. When was I due? Did Michael know? Was I feeling okay? Had I been to the doctor yet? I answered each one, laughing through my tears, feeling lighter with every word. She kept touching the ultrasound photo like it might disappear if she looked away. Then she said something that broke me open completely. She said she was going to be a different grandmother than she had been a mother. She promised me that. We called Jenna together, putting her on speakerphone so we could hear her scream of excitement. She demanded to know everything, already planning baby showers and shopping trips and all the ways she would spoil her future niece or nephew. My mother watched me talk to my sister, her face glowing with happiness I had never seen before. This was what family was supposed to feel like. This warmth, this celebration, this unguarded joy. I had waited 35 years to experience it. That evening, we gathered for an impromptu dinner to celebrate. Michael came over, enduring my mother's endless questions about his intentions and his family medical history. Jenna arrived with sparkling cider and a onesie that said, "World's Cutest Human." My father joined by video call from Ohio, his face filling my mother's tablet screen as he offered congratulations and wiped tears from his eyes. A year ago, this scene would have been impossible. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through winter and into spring. My mother transformed into someone I barely recognized, constantly researching baby products and texting me articles about prenatal nutrition. She started knitting a blanket, something she hadn't done since Jenna and I were small. Every Sunday dinner included discussions about nursery themes and name possibilities. She had opinions about everything, and for once I welcomed her involvement. She was showing up for me in ways she never had before. Michael proposed on a snowy evening in February, kneeling in the same coffee shop where my father and I had our first meeting. I said yes before he finished asking, crying and laughing while other customers applauded. My mother helped plan the wedding, small and intimate, scheduled for early summer before the baby arrived. She threw herself into the preparations with enthusiasm I found both touching and slightly overwhelming. But I let her, understanding that this was her way of making amends. My father came to the wedding, his first time back in this town since he left 30 years ago. He walked through familiar streets that held painful memories, past the house where he once lived with my mother, into the small church where he watched his eldest daughter marry a good man. He sat in the second row, my mother beside him, both of them crying as I said my vows. Afterward, he told me he was proud of the woman I had become. His words felt like a blessing I didn't know I needed. Summer arrived hot and heavy, and so did I. At 8 months pregnant, I felt like a small planet with feet. Michael was attentive and patient, rubbing my swollen ankles and making midnight runs for ice cream. My mother came over almost daily, helping prepare the nursery and cook meals I could freeze for after the baby came. Jenna visited whenever her schedule allowed, treating my belly like a beloved friend, talking to it in silly voices that made me laugh. The baby came on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, after 12 hours of labor that tested every ounce of strength I possessed. Michael held my hand through all of it, steady and calm even when I was neither. My mother waited in the hallway, pacing and praying, unable to sit still. When they finally placed my daughter in my arms, I understood something I had never understood before. The love a parent feels for their child is immediate and overwhelming, larger than any emotion I had ever experienced. We named her Grace, for the grandmother whose house brought our family back together, and for the grace that made our healing possible. My mother held her for the first time with trembling hands and reverent eyes, promising to love her better than she knew how to love before. My father met her through a video screen, tears streaming down his face as he whispered hello to the granddaughter he never expected to have. Our broken family had created something new and perfect and full of hope. The months that followed were exhausting and beautiful. Sleepless nights blurred into bleary mornings, feedings and diaper changes becoming my new rhythm. But I was never alone. My mother came every week, sometimes more, helping with laundry and cooking, and simply holding Grace while I showered or napped. Jenna visited with toys and books, already imagining the adventure she would share with her niece. Michael's parents embraced me as their own, expanding my family in ways I had never anticipated. On Grace's first birthday, we gathered in my grandmother's garden, now lush with flowers my mother had planted over the past 2 years. The whole family was there: my mother, my father, Jenna, Michael's parents, and a few close friends who had become like family. Grace sat in the grass, chubby fingers reaching for petals, completely unaware of the long and complicated journey that led to her existence. She was born into love, surrounded by people who had chosen healing over bitterness. I watched my mother bounce Grace on her hip, singing the same lullabies she once sang to me. I watched my father capture the moment on his phone, determined to never miss another milestone. I watched Jenna help Michael light the birthday candles, their laughter floating through the warm summer air, and I understood that everything I had survived, The invisibility, the loneliness, the years of feeling unloved had led me here. Not despite the pain, but through it. My story had become one of redemption, of family rebuilt from fragments, of love that refused to give up.